Hey everyone, welcome to the 333rd episode of the Internet of Things podcast. This is your host, Stacey Higginbotham, and your co-host,
Kevin Toffel.
And we have a jam-packed show for you today. We're going to be talking about SpaceX acquiring Swarm, a lot of money getting invested into Helium in kind of a crazy way. We've got a survey out about malvertising, targeting IoT devices. We've got an update from the Samsung Galaxy Unpacked event. We've got a story on building the wall at the border and making it smart. Plus, it's a day that ends in Y, so we have another product from Wise. And we also have a connected sump pump out there for people with basements and neuroses. No, not neuroses. We'll talk about it. We also are going to just get a quick update on some new offerings from Legrand that might interest a couple of y'all. We're also going to hear from our sponsor, Very. And after that, we're going to hear from Rob Aitken from ARM. We're going to be talking about low power computing going up in nanometers to actually build new designs and a lot of innovation around chip design focused on price performance per watt. So it's going to be a little nerdy, but y'all are going to appreciate it. I know it. With all of that in mind, let's start the show with a message from our sponsor. This week's sponsor is Very. Are you looking for an IoT development firm that has been there and done that? Very has an award-winning team of senior engineers, designers, and data scientists who are going to work with you to get your biggest IoT hardware and software products fully operational. You can learn more at www.verypossible.com. Okay, Kevin, big news in the space. Actually, it's big news in space. Swarm was recently acquired by SpaceX for an undisclosed amount. We only found out about this because they actually made a filing with the FCC saying, hey, just a little update. And this is a really interesting news, not just because SpaceX is the company providing broadband over satellite. It's also owned by Elon Musk. So we had the CEO of Swarm actually on the podcast a couple months ago, and she talked about these. Swarm is building an IoT network that lets you have a $60 tile device that receives the Swarm satellite signals. You can transmit small amounts of data over this network for $5 a month. This is crazy revolutionary pricing. SpaceX is doing broadband. There are different satellite bands. So the type of spectrum they're using, SpaceX is in the Ka/Ku band, and Swarm is using the VHF spectrum. I always want to say VHS, but it is not videotapes.
The Betamax spectrum.
We're talking about very high frequency. Why did this deal happen is basically what everyone's like, what? This makes no sense.
Oh, but it does, I think.
Oh, it does? You think it does? Well, tell me why you think it makes sense.
Well, I do, because SpaceX is, as you said, putting out satellites to bring mobile broadband, broadband, I should say, to all areas of the globe. That's the idea. Cover the globe with satellite-based internet service for people that maybe, don't live in urban areas, don't have choice of their home broadband provider, etc. And they're trying to do that at a reasonable price. But there's nothing really to do with the IoT with what SpaceX is currently delivering. However, as we know, IoT data has to get around the globe as well for tracking, for example, package tracking, supply chain information. So we've basically leveraged terrestrial type signals to do that, regular networks, either Wi-Fi or LoRa or cellular or whatever it might be. But why not have this in space? Why not have some alternative at a low cost? We talked about costs last week for smart cities and how they're very high in the US, whereas maybe not so high in Europe. What if there was a global IoT network that for $5 a month, you could have your sensor send 750 data packets a month?
Exactly. So yes, I think this is really two things. One, it gets SpaceX another business opportunity while it's working on delivering real broadband to more places. Some people, it's still an early service. We'll just leave it at that. Mm-hmm. Now, Swarm is also in early service, but they do have 150 small sats out in the air, little nanosats, and their connectivity is actually really good. I'm actually testing their eval kit right now, and next week we'll put that out as a review. But this is a legit technology for sensors. It also gets Elon Musk two really good tech people. The company was founded by Sarah Spangolo and Ben Longmire. And Spangolo has worked on small sats, and she was a lead systems engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab and at Google X. Longmire has sold a company to Apple and is just all around a known entity. So what we've got is two superstars building out an ancillary network for SpaceX, basically. So they get the people, they get this kind of cool business that's already up and running, and
yeah, they get another revenue stream. And there's something else that we probably haven't talked about much because it may be too early, but satellite to satellite communication, sensor data from one going to another. Maybe there's a loss of connectivity in one satellite and it can't transmit its sensor data back to the planet, but it could transmit it to another satellite with the swarm technology, and then that one could do so. I think there's a future opportunity for this type of network in space.
I hadn't thought about that. And I will say also the next big wave of innovation in satellites outside of, nanosats and CubeSats, basically these smaller sats that you can shove up there very easily or inexpensively, I should say. The next big kind of iteration is going to be in software that helps manage collisions, or rather avoid collisions, help optimize for demand, those sorts of things. So like a very reactive piece of software based on customer experience down in Earth. And I think that these are two people who could help build something like that. So I'm excited about this deal. Congratulations, and look forward next week to our Swarm review. Next up, another company that we have known and loved for years, Helium. They just raised $111 million, and they did it via a token sale. So the Helium network tokens, they sold 111 million of them to Andreessen Horowitz. Well, it was a sale led by Andreessen Horowitz. Other companies also participated. The purpose of this funding is apparently to boost Helium's 5G network coverage. Let's divide this story up into two. One, I'm going to tell you what Helium's trying to do. Two, we'll talk about the 5G network stuff. Helium is for now, it is a low-power, wide-area broadband network. So they're using LoRa. They also have what Helium calls their Long-Fi protocol. Basically, they're building a sensor network. It's distributed. It's a mesh. If you run these Helium miners, you're providing coverage. And as part of providing coverage, you're getting a fraction of a token, a Helium network token, in exchange. Companies that want to use Helium's network buy these tokens and thus kind of, I don't want to say inflate the value, but that's what the value is set against, is these companies are going to buy these tokens in exchange for a data credit. And that means they get data, they can send data around on the Helium network. So basically, Helium's messing with the economics of low-power, wide-area networks to make it super cheap. And that's great. That's the same thing Amazon is doing with its Sidewalk network.
Just to be clear, if you have a Helium hotspot / miner, you are providing the internet connection for the sensor data to go where it needs to go.
Yes. Like I have a miner. I am providing network coverage. I'm sending and receiving LoRa data from it, and it's going to the internet through my home Wi-Fi. So that is how that works. What they're also doing, back in April, Helium said that they were working with FreedomFi to build a similar decentralized token-powered 5G network that uses the CBRS span. So the funding is supposed to be for the decentralized peer-to-peer 5G network that Helium is building out. This requires new miners that are going to work in this particular spectrum band, which is actually in the 3.5 gigahertz band. So this isn't going to be your existing miners. They're not going to work on the 5G network. They don't have those radios. But the idea here is that you're going to pay people in Helium network tokens to set up 5G hotspots everywhere and then do backhaul on that. I think this is a harder sell for a couple reasons. 5G networks can send a lot more data. It's unclear how that's going to work. It's not like right now, for example, I can't really overwhelm my network connection. But if I were on like a certain type of connection, I don't think I could support a 5G. That's massive bandwidth potential there. So that's one. Two, it's unclear what devices are going to use this right now, because the CBRS band, running 5G over that means you have to have 5G devices that support that band. We just did the spectrum auction for that last year. So we don't have those devices really. They're not out in the field yet. They're being developed. And most people who are deploying this as some sort of private area factory network. So I don't see how the decentralized nature of this comes into play. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate what Helium is trying to do here. You know, they're doing this whole decentralized, quote unquote, the people's network. And I think it works really well for something such as LoRaWAN, sensor networks, and so on. It's similar in a sense to Amazon's Sidewalk network, only it's not as proprietary, I guess would be the best word. But when it comes to 5G, now you're going to compete against established carriers who bid on that spectrum. We don't know what they're going to do with it. I mean, we can assume that they'll integrate those.
I mean, some of the companies that bid on it are like AT&T, Verizon,
T-Mo, yeah.
But we also have like John Deere bid on it. So did Chevron. So did, I think, a couple of universities.
And that makes sense because if you want a private 5G network and you're at John Deere, you could do it this way.
So maybe what we'll see is AT&T and these companies who've invested in this space invest in Helium. That would be a really interesting. I mean, I can't see them going after their business model that way, but sure.
No.
5G is expensive and requires a lot of really smart antennas.
And this is where I think that the stumbling block is going to come into play. We know that there are no current, say, consumer devices, for example, phones or tablets that have the radios for this frequency. How does Helium convince phone makers to do this? I mean, they may do it anyway for Verizon and T-Mo and so on, but that doesn't necessarily mean it would be compatible.
I don't see this as a phone technology, but we're going to
reach out to kind of pushing it as one, as they said.
I feel like that's marketing. We're going to ignore that for a while. We're going to see.
Okay.
So that's the update. I will say on news of this, the Helium token price, Helium Network token exchange rate, they're now priced at like 17 something dollars a token when they were right before this news. They were trending up at like 12 to 13, but they had gone as low as like 8. So this news is really exciting the Helium people, I guess. Well,
you're a Helium people.
I am a Helium person, but I don't pretend that I know what's going to happen with the price. I'll be honest.
And I will be one as soon as my hotspot ships, which is like 3 months late now.
Yes. Like we'll have a party on the show when Kevin gets his hotspot. Okay, let's talk about, and someone pointed this out. It's not malvertising, as in going to the mall. It's malvertising, as in
malware and advertising.
So tell us about this story.
So this is interesting. We know what malware is. You know, that's where you are, your device is basically infected with some type of attack or remote control access to your devices. And it's pretty typical within web browsers and occasionally some mobile apps. Well, now it can be spread apparently through online display ads. And you'd think, what does that have to do with my devices? But apparently, the company that wrote a report about it, GeoEdge, and I will disclose right away that they are a company that sells malware protection, especially in the advertising segment. So, I question if this is truly a major issue or not. But theoretically, let's take that out of play. If I could download malware in an ad and not even know it on my home network through my phone or whatever, potentially what they're saying is it could get to your IoT devices. And that is a problem for remote access and so on, say for cameras, microphones, and whatever. So apparently this malware that they say they've found or are talking about can actually install itself on your IoT devices. And this actually gets me into why not all, but most most devices on the IoT should have TPMs or trusted platform modules that verify that the firmware has not been tampered with. There's no extra programs running and so on. So that's really, to me, the bigger takeaway than malvertising. We really need some type of firmware protection in our devices.
Yes, and we're going to talk about what that means for like your old device strategy a little later when we answer a listener's question. So also, speaking of devices, these are new. These are so new, they're not even out yet. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened at the Samsung Unpacked event?
Yeah, it actually began just before we started recording the show. And lucky for me, the first half hour was all about what I cared about the most, not the folding phones and such, but the Galaxy Watch 4 and Galaxy Watch 4 Classic, which were introduced today. They are available for pre-order now at $249 and $349, depending on the model you choose, and you'll have them by the end of August, according to Samsung. Why would I care about these, and why should you? Well, these are the first Wear OS powered by Samsung devices. So going back to Google I/O, when Google said, hey, we bought Fitbit, we're integrating Fitbit into Wear OS, and hey, now we're going to work with Samsung and bring the best of Tizen, Samsung's mobile operating system, into Wear OS. So these will run Wear OS 3 with a skin called Samsung One UI. So that's where part of the integration comes from. So I don't know much more about the whole underlying operating system yet because, again, these just came out and they are the first. But there are some new sensors in these watches, in the Galaxy Watch 4 and 4 Classic. There's a 3-in-1 bioactive sensor that gives you optical heart rate, which, okay, we've had that for a while. EKG or ECG, we've had that for a while. This is new though. BIA or bioelectrical impedance analysis. So you can get your blood pressure, detect AFib, blood oxygen level, and more importantly, calculate your body composition. So they will tell you your lean muscle mass, your skeletal mass, and so on. And when I told Stacy about this just before the show, she's like, Halo does that and it does it very accurately. Yes, Amazon Halo does do that. I presume it's accurate, but you've got to take a photo of your mostly naked body to do that. And you weren't too keen on that, were you?
Oh my God. It was one of the most traumatizing device review experiences ever.
Yes. Well, you won't have to do that because this will just do this by touching the side buttons as well as the sensor that's on the wrist. So it sends an electrical impulse for 15 seconds and you create the circuit and it measures everything. So and so you can do this anytime. And they say it's 98% as effective as the DEX standard, which is apparently the gold standard for figuring out lean and muscle mass and all that such.
Basically, yeah, you can see through your whole body. It's very exciting.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay.
But with your clothes on.
Yes. So, and speaking of surveillance, let's just go there. This is a story from the New America Foundation. This is a group that is it's a think tank that promotes internet freedoms, I guess is the best way to think about it. They did a study about the border wall along the southern border. And we are probably well aware that in most places it's a fence, in some places it's a brand new funky looking wall. People can get over it all the time because people want to be here and they're smart. But instead of just being a physical wall, we have now turned it into a virtual wall with things like underground sensors, remote video surveillance towers. They're also, Customs and Border Patrol are expanding the use of facial recognition technology for use in land crossings when we come over and possibly when other people try to come over again, and they might get flagged in that database. So the idea here is that our wall has been virtual for a while and has had some of these capabilities, but the Biden administration is actually going to make it smarter. And there's a little worry about what that might look like and if that's fair for people. So what's happening is we are using technology to create in certain places a surveillance state that is impossible to really escape because these sensors are so cheap, because the technology is so advanced. So in the most recent Appropriations Committee meeting, the House Appropriations Committee proposed providing $475 million in DHS, Department of Homeland Security funding, to support the Immigration and Customs Enforcement program that helps fund some of this technology. It also allocated $21 million towards a planned database for storing people's iris scans and facial images and other biometric data from immigrants. There's even more money for drones and that sort of thing. And basically, I don't know if we want to see this normalized at this level. And that's kind of New America's status as well.
It's interesting because it's not like, for me as a U.S. citizen, I'm sitting here going, well, they're not surveilling me in this particular effort. We're basically surveilling over the wall and near the wall. Like they're talking about drones collecting license plate information, getting photographs of vehicle interiors. But I mean, so what happens if I'm near the wall on vacation? Am I going to end up in that database? And there's a slippery slope here.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think it's important to think, hey, just because we don't see a wall, because we're not going to bulldoze huge areas of the Rio Grande, doesn't mean that there isn't a wall there, and that in some ways this wall is a little bit more pernicious, I guess.
Well, in a sense, if you have a smart home, you may have that wall yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I have a wall around my house that surveils with outdoor cameras and so on. I don't have a database. Well, in a sense, I do. I've got familiar faces that are recognized, and yeah, I mean.
The other thing is, how do you use it? So we might be using it to keep people out, much like you and I in our homes, but we're probably not storing that data in case that person we see walking, like let's say we see the same person walking again and again down the street. We may not flag them and try to arrest them. But with the power of the U.S. government, you might be able to do something like that.
Right. Almost gets back to the Ring neighborhood challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Because it does capture that information and send it to law enforcement if they want it, where they could act upon that information.
Yeah. So I don't know. We're not having a wall possibly that's physical, but there will still be a wall there. And by enacting that wall, we're bringing in we're opening a can of worms that might travel down a slippery slope.
My advice is if you go near this invisible wall, walk with a flock of cows, because apparently that is setting off the alarms, the underground sensors.
There you
mistakenly. So hide amongst the cows.
Okay. Speaking of cameras, Wise has a new security camera product. It is basically designed, it's a spotlight on top of a Wise Cam. It's the Wise Cam Spotlight. It is their normal square-shaped camera, and it has a built-in light to illuminate people. Google, actually, we didn't talk about this, but, because I think it hadn't gone live at the time, but Google refreshed last week its security line with new cameras, a new doorbell. The doorbell is now battery-powered if you want it to be, or wired. There's a battery-powered camera, or it can be wired. There's a camera with lights, and then a cheaper indoor camera. So this particular Wise camera is probably going to compete against the Google Nest Cam with Spotlight, which, let me tell you, is very expensive at $279.99 and will be out at some point.
That is like a legit dual bulb spotlight system. That's not a small little, this is almost like a webcam spotlight. I'm sure it's bright enough to do what it needs to do, but this is just literally a spotlight that's smaller than the small Wise Cam on top of a Wise Cam. And it's like $50.
It is $49.96, and its regular price is going to be $51.95. So, yeah, this is tiny, cheap camera with light. If you're into that sort of thing, go for it. I will say also on the Google News, the only other thing that's worth thinking about here is all of those devices. There was no mention of Matter, but they are doing on-device machine learning and it's not the actual learning, it's just identifying 9 different classes of objects, but it all happens locally on the cameras, which is pretty cool.
Including dogs and cats.
Including dogs, cats, familiar faces, that requires a subscription, package delivery, vehicles. We don't know about birds. All right, other new products. Kevin, you wrote about, I can't get excited about it, but you certainly were.
How could you not?
I don't have a basement.
So you don't have a basement. Okay, so for anybody who doesn't have a basement, I'm sorry I'm about to bore you by the most, or I should say least glamorous, but most practical for me, IoT device. It is a new smart sump pump. Oh yeah, and everybody just said, skip ahead 10 minutes. Okay.
You're not talking about this for 10 minutes.
All right. We'll talk about it for three. This is a $450 sump pump. It's the Wayne Basement Guardian Halo 1, available directly or on Amazon. And it's just what it sounds like. It's a regular sump pump, but it has the inclusion of an IoT controller that's made by Grid Connect. And what it does is it has a Wi-Fi radio inside, so you can connect your sump pump to your network. So you can use the mobile app to see what the water level is in the sump pit, or the pump activity, the pump health, because it's actually measuring electrical signals inside the pump mechanism to predict potential breakdown issues or burnout issues. And the reason I'm so excited about this is because I have had more than $5,000 of flood damage from a failed sump pump while my wife and I were both at work, and it wasn't covered by insurance because of a stupid sump pump rider we did not have. Whatever. This would resolve that problem. That scared me so much that I have a sump pump, and I actually have a spare sump pump next to my sump pump to quickly swap out, like I had to do when we had the flood in knee-deep cold water that time. Oh, so bad. I still have nightmares.
Wait, let us briefly tell people, in case you don't know, a sump pump is used with people who have basements, and it just literally pumps the water out of your basement.
Right. You have a pit that goes below the basement, and when that pit fills up with water, you can visibly see it. Your pump would actually pump it out to the outside, so that way your basement doesn't flood. So again, not everybody has this. I totally understand that. But for those that do, you know what I'm talking about. If you've had a pump burn out from overuse, or you've lost power and your pump couldn't go and your basement was flooded. Maybe you have a battery backup in that case, that's fine. But those pumps can't do what this can do, such as the real-time alerts via in-app notifications or text or emails. It can't tell if there's a clog in your water discharge pipe, which I have had before. It can measure the flow of the water going through that discharge pipe. We've had squirrels living in our pipe once before and slowing down things. But I'm excited about this because for two reasons. One, it's a product that I could definitely use. Two, it's not the same old IoT smart connected product that somebody just threw Wi-Fi in. It's not a new bulb, a new bridge, a new whatever. This actually makes your smart home smart if you have a sump pit.
Okay. And it's about twice as much with the smarts?
At least. I mean, yeah, you could buy a cheap sump pump, but don't do that.
Don't do that. You'll pay it back later. All right. In other new product news, Legrand, which is a manufacturer of electrical switches, lights, outlets, all sorts of things. And let me tell you, they are beautiful. These are pretty high end. They bought a company called Netamo, I can't tell, in 2018.
It won't matter now because they were bought.
Well, they're using the Netamo Zigbee technology to basically retrofit. They're offering a new product, which is a battery-powered light switch. But if you buy this, it will work with your existing either Radiant or Adorn lights. Those are the two nice Legrand connected lights. You just basically can use this as a three-way switch anywhere in your home. So it's battery powered. So what you're going to do is you buy this switch, and it means you can control any of your Legrand light switches from anywhere in the house. And it's a very simple, easy thing to do. It's kind of like if you're familiar with Lutron, you can buy a Pico and you can put it in a switch format and you can control whatever lights you want with that Pico remote. So this is the same thing. So yay.
And they use Zigbee for this?
They do use Zigbee. Yeah, this is not yet Thread. This is, for all of us who are like waiting for more Thread devices to happen because of Matter. This is not that, but this is going to be welcome for a couple people who have this product, and I think it's smart.
Well, and the nice thing is, we didn't hear about Thread yet, but these are supported on the major digital assistants by voice, so Madame, Google, and Siri, and apparently will be compatible with HomeKit.
Yay! All right, now it is time for the section of the show where we hear from y'all. It is time for the IoT Podcast Hotline, which is sponsored by Silicon Labs Works With event. This event is taking place virtually September 14th through 15th, and it is the only one in existence that brings the entirety of the IoT together. You're going to be able to learn about IoT trends in the smart home, in electrical, in smart cities, in industrial. It's going to be awesome. You're going to have training, market discussions, and workshops from the biggest names and ecosystems in the industry. You can register at workswith.scilabs.com. Okay, and I will be there. So, the Internet of Things podcast hotline. This exists for you to ask us your questions, and maybe we will answer them on the show. You will also be entered to win. This time it's going to be the smart speaker of your choice. And you can call us at 512-623-7424. And this week's voicemail comes to us from Billy, and he's asking about Insteon and Telnet. So it's like a blast from the past. Let's hear it.
Hi, Stacey and Kevin. This is Billy in Montana. I had a question about Telnet. So I have an Insteon smart lighting system in my house, and I'm using the ISY 994i hub, I guess, or automation bridge or whatever you want to call it. I really like it, and I'm using Home Assistant as my main sort of software that runs everything, and the ISY is basically just bringing that into Home Assistant. But I believe the connection protocol for the ISY hub is Telnet, and while I don't have it attached to the internet, it is on my home network, my LAN. And so I was wondering if there's vulnerabilities there, even though it's not attached to the internet, it is on my LAN, and if there's anything I can do other than just using something different, because I do really love the machine.
Okay, so Billy, I actually use that same ISY 994i. It's basically a headless server. So it's just a box that runs all your Insteon gear. I used that back in 2010. I know they've updated it. It's great. You have total control over everything, which is a wonderful thing. You're also running Home Assistant. So I presume you've got that on a Raspberry Pi in your house. And I know you can interconnect your Insteon hub and Home Assistant. So that's awesome. Here's my thought, and it's probably, you're not going to like it. I obviously don't use my Insteon anymore. I've moved on to various other platforms between Amazon, Google, Samsung, Apple, etc. I worry about Telnet in my home. I would not want anything that uses Telnet for communication just because there are so many Telnet exploits out there. We've covered them time and time again. And I'm not saying that keeping your Insteon gear will guarantee some type of network exploit, but I don't know how to protect it from a Telnet exploit. Personally, I would move on to something more modern that uses more modern communications, such as MQTT or some other communications protocols. I just don't think I would stick with the Insteon. And I know there's going to be people that do not like my answer and will probably get some hate mail. And I understand that. I expect it. But me personally, I would not want Telnet in my house.
Camera systems and things that use Telnet are notorious for vulnerabilities.
Yep.
And a lot of these devices can't be updated with like secure enclaves or some other hardware-based security functionality. So what happens is you get a lot of hackers targeting these systems. Just because it hasn't been targeted yet doesn't mean it won't be. And you really can't retrofit at the hardware level. You just have to move on to something more modern, which is why we're recommending this. I know you're not going to like it. I'm really sorry.
But, if he's happy using Home Assistant right now, the switchover probably would be lessened because certain devices that are Insteon only could be replaced by something that works with Home Assistant. Whereas if he didn't have anything but the Insteon system, he'd have to replace everything potentially.
That is true. So we're sorry to give you bad news, but we want you to be secure. This is literally what you asked us about. So.
He asked our opinion, and we're sharing it. I'm not saying you got to do it.
That is true. This is all up to you, my friend. All right. Well, if you would like to ask us a question and have us deliver more bad news or real talk for you, give us a call at 512-263-7424, and you will be entered to win a smart speaker of your choice. And now it is time for the guest segment. We will be talking to Rob Aitken from ARM about the end of Moore's Law, why we're focusing on price performance per watt, and what kind of innovations we can expect for the IoT that don't involve basically cramming more transistors on a chip. So stay tuned for that. And now a word from our sponsor. This week's sponsor is Very. Hey everyone, we are taking a quick break from the Internet of Things podcast for a message from our sponsor. This week's sponsor is Very, a leading IoT engineering firm. And fans of this podcast might be interested to know that Very has launched a podcast of its own about the IoT space called the Over the Air podcast. And I have Ryan Prosser, the CEO of Very. Ryan, I'd love for you to share a little bit about the podcast with our listeners today.
Thanks, Stacey. Yeah, sure thing. The podcast is called Over the Air, IoT Connected Devices in the Journey. And so far, we've had a lot of big guests on, including the former CEO of Boeing, who's gone on to raise a bunch of money for IoT initiatives in space. I also recently interviewed the CEO of Monarch Motors, who've developed essentially Tesla for tractors.
All right, so tell us, why did you start this podcast?
Rather than outcomes, we really wanted to dive into the journey and share those experiences with the audience, aka what went right, what went wrong, and how our listeners can bake those lessons into their own IoT initiatives. You're going to hear business leaders sharing, kind of warts and all lessons they've learned. And that hopefully gets them thinking, oh my God, I would have made that mistake.
I love it. I love that kind of show. So what can you tell us about the types of things you'll be focused on?
One thing that I personally am really passionate about is unpacking and exploring the missteps and some of the scar tissue related to those lessons learned, especially mistakes that didn't appear to be mistakes at the outset. Why was that not the correct path? What would you have done differently? Things like that. What we see a lot at Very, and we see hundreds of these major engagements a year, is that there aren't nearly as many unique problems as you'd expect. There are a lot of common mistakes that are avoidable. They're incredibly difficult, but rarely unique. And if you see enough repetitions, patterns start to emerge. And our goal for the audience is for them to get those repetitions or some of those repetitions vicariously through these interviews. We really love it when clients ask us, I wonder how company X solved this problem because it looks and feels a lot like what we're dealing with. Since we have those repetitions, we often know the answer.
So if anyone listening to this has their own amazing story to tell or knows someone who does, or they wish that you would cover a certain topic, what is the best way for them to reach out to your team to suggest guests or topics for the show in the future?
Definitely email us, podcast@verypossible.com. You can also DM me on LinkedIn. My handle is rprosser26.
And where can listeners go to find the podcast?
So like you said, the podcast is called Over the Air, IoT Connected Devices and the Journey. And you can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Internet of Things podcast. This is your host, Stacey Higginbotham, and today's guest is Rob Aitken, who is an ARM Fellow and Director of Technology. Hello, Rob. How are you today?
Hello, Stacey. I'm very well, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so we are here to talk about, I'm going to just call it the future of computing, because why not have a big, bold, crazy title? And based on something that you have written, the future of computing is low power, or rather thinking of efficient energy use as the main driver in computing. Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
We measure that as price performance per watt. So how much performance you can get per watt of energy put into the system. Prior to this, you write that Moore's law was kind of the governing law of computing. And now we're thinking about energy. So tell us a little bit about why you came to that conclusion.
I guess there are a couple of factors behind. So as you know, it's not as though energy has suddenly popped into existence as an important criterion. I think it's more the case that the measurement of Moore's law has been historically performance. How can we squeeze more and more performance? How can we do more and more things? And as Moore's law slows, the ability to gain that performance is lessening. And that's been true for a while. But I think what's becoming more true as time goes on is that the limitations of any compute situation, whether it's an Internet of Things object or something in a data center, are being increasingly affected by the power and energy envelope that they operate in. And then beyond that, one of the points that I was trying to make in the blog is that if we're going to go into a sustainable future, we not only need to look at how can we do more compute in the same power envelope, we also need to increasingly look at how can we do the same compute in a smaller power envelope, and how can we reduce the energy consumption of various compute functions around us. And that was kind of where I was trying to get to, I think.
So a big focus of this particular blog post was on the end of Moore's Law. So why don't you explain to us first what Moore's Law is?
Sure. So in 1964, Gordon Moore, who went on to become one of the founders and CEO of Intel, published a paper where he noted that the transistor density that was achievable on a given piece of silicon was doubling at the time every year, but it eventually slowed to every 18 months to 2 years. And that Moore's Law is effectively that the economical device density would double every couple of years, which meant that you could have twice as many transistors in the same space. That was further augmented by Robert Dennard of IBM with what's called Dennard scaling, which was the observation that in a classic MOS transistor, when you shrink its dimensions, everything else gets better too. So power got better, performance got better. And so effectively, the heyday of Moore's Law was a free ride in a way of ever increasing transistor and device performance, while at the same time lowering or maintaining cost.
Yes, it was very exciting. I remember those years. And it almost seems like we might be going back to a place where Moore's Law is relevant again, simply because we see Intel recently announced that it was going down to 7 and 5 nanometer chips. And we see TSMC doing 3 nanometer chips. And so the end of Moore's Law doesn't necessarily mean we're going to stop jamming more transistors on a chip, does it?
No, it doesn't. And you're right. We do continue to see advances in technology, and we are continuing to find new ways of squeezing more devices onto a chip. But the Dennard scaling property of when you do that, everything else gets better is no longer true. At this point, when you shrink devices, they often get worse. So the performance goes down and the power goes up. And working around that has been the focus of a lot of what ARM does and what other companies in high tech have been doing as well, just trying to figure out how to make design and architecture changes that get around the transistor limitations.
True. I almost feel like we're sort of late on this. So if I think about when Moore's Law was happening, we were like, ooh, we can make our computers faster, smaller, more powerful. And then we got things like, oh, hey, virtualization. And then we didn't need like super powerful chips all dedicated to one thing because you could split them out. So it became much more interesting to offer someone maybe a more power efficient chip to run in like a 10,000 computer data center that didn't need to have all of the power driving one application because you could split it up. And that, I feel, opened up some opportunities to rethink just computing in itself. And then the mobile phone revolution did it again. And so I would love to hear where you're thinking about computing going and why price performance per watt makes so much sense to focus on.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think what we see, or what I see going forward in the future of computing, is a movement away from the Moore's Law will automatically take care of everything. Again, if you go back to the heyday of Moore's Law, if you had two design teams, one of whom thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to focus on improving the architecture and developing some new clever design, and it's going to take me a while to get this done. And you had a second design team that said, I'm not really going to do anything except just wait for the next Moore's Law iteration to come along and shrink last time's design. The second design team actually won most of the time. And so there's been this pent-up set of architecture and design improvements that we're starting to go through and have been going through over the last few years that have compensated for the decline in transistor performance by improving the way we do processing. And the processing per watt per dollar focus really helps you, or helps all of us, to look at the trade-offs that people are making in terms of, do I want to have a specialized processor that's dedicated to my particular workload, or do I want to have a general purpose thing that I can adapt more in the future? That having these energy and power constraints and envelopes that the system has to operate in allows you to frame those decisions differently than you might otherwise. So if you have a you're trying to run your IoT device off of a battery or off of a very small USB charger or something like that, you have this tiny power envelope. You don't want to waste a bunch of that on unnecessary functionality. You'd like to devote as much as you possibly can to doing whatever it is that you want that device to do. So I think there's an era of increased specialization coming up, but it's not just a matter of saying, oh, I have an algorithm, let's make some hardware that does it. There's a lot of complexity around that. And the focus on performance per watt per dollar helps us to frame those discussions well, I think.
Awesome. So I'm just going to run through something. If I'm thinking of silicon and chips in my devices, I can focus on performance. So that's how many megahertz or gigahertz or how many cores it runs or different options there. I can think about cost, like just the cost of the silicon itself. So is this going to be an expensive thing to build? I can think about power consumption, and I can think, should I be thinking about flexibility? With that, I'm thinking about things like, hey, we don't always know like how an algorithm, like because we're doing so much more machine learning, right? One algorithm might be optimized one way versus another. So do you want a chip that can do both algorithms? Is the job big enough that you need a dedicated thing to run only that one algorithm? And I think that probably goes back to the cost of the chip, because there are still economies of scale here. So is that kind of the way people should be thinking about, I guess, selecting or designing their own silicon now?
That's exactly right. So when you look at something like a neural processor, when ARM was looking at how to design our own neural processors, we were thinking about what are the existing machine learning algorithms, combination or convolutional neural nets and so on, and how do we adopt how do we design a thing that's future-proof to some extent that future algorithms and future ways of doing machine learning will also run on this object. And so there's a set of thought processes you have to go through to design something that's able to handle expected improvements in future design. You do the same thing on a product level of, do I want to upgrade the firmware in this object at some point? Will I need to because of security considerations? So you want to design with as much specialization as you can within the context of there may be some changes in the future that I will have to adopt to. So we're actually seeing, I think, a fairly strong in Internet of Things world demand for combinations of microcontrollers and neural processing units. So I think there's that particular combination in IoT space offers a lot of flexibility to do a fair amount of local machine learning at a reasonable power budget.
Okay, so should I think about adding flexibility? So I know we've got price performance per watt, which covers performance and how much it costs and energy usage. But should we also start thinking about bringing flexibility into there?
I think, at some extent, I think that is a consideration of anyone doing system design. Is you have on one end of the spectrum, you could design an ASIC, a circuit that was completely dedicated to your particular workload and could do nothing else. So that's extremely power efficient, but it's also extremely inflexible. And on the other end, you have a classic CPU where you could program it to do whatever you wanted in software, but its performance would be lower than the ASIC, and its power consumption would be higher, but at the same time, it's effectively as flexible as you can get. So when you design something, you want to be somewhere on that spectrum. And where we want to be, I think, in the future is I think we want to have as much flexibility as we can get while still operating efficiently within a power envelope that's going to remain either constant or shrink.
Okay, so, and I'm taking you a little far afield on the power thing, but I think it's worth discussing as part of the bigger, I guess, system design package, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we address the fact that most of the large tech companies, whether they're worried about servers or maybe they're designing chips for their cell phones, they're doing their own silicon designs because they have a huge footprint for their products. So it makes sense for them to do that. What do you say to any other team trying to build products that obviously is like, well, I can't design my own silicon to optimize all of these things. What does that mean for all of the little guys trying to compete with some of the bigger companies out there?
I think there are several ways to look at the answer. So one being that if you look at what a lot of these hyperscaler people are putting into silicon, they're putting things into silicon that provide a functionality for them in their, say, data center environment that just does not exist in a commercial chip. And it makes the economics of doing that for them are very different than somebody selling a chip on the open market. They have a task that needs doing. The chip itself doesn't have to make a profit. It just has to make sure that whatever function they want to do is done more efficiently. On the other hand, the idea that, say, a small group of people can't get together and build a chip, I think it depends how you come at the problem. And again, going back to Moore's Law world, if you look at designing a chip in 130 nanometer or 180 nanometer, it doesn't take that much effort. It might cost several $100 million to build a 5 nanometer chip, but 3 people in 6 months, you can build a 180 nanometer chip. There are some opportunities, especially in IoT space, for customized silicon for very specific applications. It's just that at the moment, the skill set required to do that is still somewhat challenging. But I think that there's the slowing of Moore's Law and, as you mentioned before, economies of scale mean that over time, we're going to see actually access to these processes become easier, simply because that's where the market is going to have to go. There won't be so many people you can sell a 1.5 nanometer or 15 angstrom or however you want to describe it chip to, but lots of people will still want a 181, and that will migrate to 90, 65, 28, and so on over time. And that opens up an era of, I think, actually more hardware design, but by people who are less concerned with squeezing the last picosecond out of their design and more concerned with how can this piece of silicon optimize my overall system. And again, performance per watt per dollar with, as you mentioned, degree of flexibility is really, I think, a key way to look at that.
I like that. I like that idea because we are very focused on in the chip world, and even mainstream reporting around semiconductors is very much about moving down to process nodes. So how many nanometers are you at? But there are plenty of fabs that are still producing at 130 or 180 nanometers. And I know things like sensors and MEMS are all produced at those, I guess, older fabs, bigger chips. And your contention is we could actually design chips for beyond MEMS or sensors. You could go for even application type processors.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that we've been looking at in ARM research as well. One of the programs that I'm involved with is it's a DARPA program on automated implementation of secure silicon. And the idea behind that is if you design a chip and you want to add modern security features to it, at the moment, you need to be an expert in security to do that. And that's undesirable. It would be better if there was a standardized object or set of objects that you could just say, you know what, my chip needs security. Please put it in for me. And it just happened. And security is not the only property that should be done that way. Power management, processors, on-chip bus, all this stuff is really something that making it easier to use for the world's customer base is something that I think is beneficial, not just to the arms of the world, but to the people around the world who could use a piece of silicon to do something, but who are challenged at the moment figuring out how to design it.
And this would help, I believe, with some of the concerns we have about shortages in chips right now, because, this is not an immediate solution because obviously designing a chip and building it and doing all of that is like a 2-year process at least. But being able to use more of the older fabs would be helpful in alleviating that, or at least mitigating some of that?
Absolutely. And the complexity involved in building a 180 nanometer fab is considerably simpler than it involves if you're going to build a 2 nanometer fab. So again, it's that you could help to alleviate future chip shortages by increasing this available supply.
Okay. And final question then would be, if we're going towards this, What is ARM doing to make it easier to add security, to add power management, to make it easier for people who are not chip designers to actually design chips that would work in this situation?
We're always looking to make our products easier to use and span more of the design space. So we offer subsystems and of various sorts and reference designs and so forth. We also have an education program that's targeted to universities and schools at the moment, but it's getting people up to speed on, how to design things. And it's the flexible licensing approach that we have where people can, rather than committing up front to, I'm going to, need to build millions of these devices, with the flexible access program, you can get in, in free in some cases to get your IP and to start using it. And you only start really paying for it as you manufacture a lot of products. So there's a lot of work that ARM is doing at the technical and the business level to try to make it easier for people to design chips and to build effective devices.
Okay, so I will promise to get excited about single digit nanometer silicon if everyone out there promises to go build something cool with, even triple digit nanometers.
Yep.
Thank you, Rob, so much for coming on the show this week.
Oh, you're welcome.
And that concludes this week's episode of the Internet of Things podcast. Please join us next Thursday and don't forget to subscribe. And if you can't get enough IoT news, I would love for you to sign up at www.stacyoniot.com for our weekly IoT newsletter, where we explain all kinds of things that we don't even get to on the show. Once again, thank you for listening and please subscribe.